He wasn't supposed to be here. The words barely left the air as the rain-slicked pavement reflected the cold, flickering lights of the makeshift field hospital. Ghost, a white German shepherd, stood rigid at the edge of the tent, his paws splayed in the mud, ears twitching to every distant sound of helicopters slicing through the smoky dawn. The scent of wet earth and faint antiseptic clung to the air, mingling with the subtle tang of salt carried from the nearby harbor. Inside, a Marine, broken and exhausted, lay strapped to a stretcher, face pale beneath the flickering fluorescent bulbs, his chest rising and falling shallowly with each deliberate breath. Ghost's amber eyes, sharp and unwavering, locked onto him without hesitation, noting the familiar curve of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched the edge of the canvas as if holding onto something beyond memory. Every instinct in the dog's body hummed with recognition, a silent pull that no one else could see. The ground beneath his paws trembled slightly as distant artillery echoed across the horizon, though the wind carried no threat here, only the whisper of broken promises and time lost. The rain continued its gentle assault on the tent, tapping in uneven rhythms, bouncing off metal crates stacked haphazardly along the periphery, and Ghost adjusted his stance, nose low, body coiled, ready for the signal he had been waiting for. The Marine stirred, a soft grunt escaping his throat as he lifted a bandaged hand, fingers brushing against the tangle of wires and straps that held him in place, and Ghost shifted forward an inch, hesitant, almost knowing the fragility of the moment. Outside, the mud was a mix of dark earth and scattered leaves, each drop of rain splashing with a quiet insistence that mirrored the tension in the air. Ghost's white coat, now damp and darkened at the tips, clung to lean muscles trained for vigilance, and every movement carried the weight of memory, of missions shared and promises silently exchanged in the shadows of foreign lands. The Marine's eyes fluttered open, green-gray flecks catching the dim light as he scanned the tent, taking in the shape of the dog, standing guard-like. A sentinel of a forgotten oath. A flashback tugged at the edges of his mind. The roar of helicopters over Kandahar, the narrow streets lined with dust and concrete, the scent of cordite and sweat blending into a memory of fear and trust intertwined. Ghost had been there then too, a white blur against the chaos, steady and unflinching, saving more than a life, saving a connection that neither war nor distance could sever. The Marine's lips parted as he whispered a name he wasn't sure he remembered, a sound carried on a breath roughened by months of neglect and recovery, and Ghost's ears pricked higher, body tensing as if he had understood every syllable. Time slowed. The rain became a soft curtain, blurring the edges of the tent, the distant lights, the shapes of the other Marines moving in slow, rehearsed motions, unaware of the silent reunion taking place. Ghost lowered his head slightly, nudging forward, paw landing softly on the canvas, a measured step toward the one he had waited for. The Marine's eyes, tired but unyielding, widened as recognition sparked, the invisible thread of loyalty pulling taut, binding them together across miles of battlefield and months of uncertainty. Each heartbeat echoed in the tent, mingling with the soft hiss of the rain and the low murmur of distant voices, creating a rhythm that only Ghost seemed to understand fully. The dog pressed closer, nudging the Marine's arm with his cold, wet nose, careful, deliberate, a small act that carried the weight of survival and the promise that nothing, not even the war itself, could break. A single droplet slid from Ghost's muzzle, landing on the Marine's hand, and he gripped it instinctively, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in fire and tested in absence. The tent fell into a hushed pause, the world outside reduced to muted rain and shadows, and in that quiet, unspoken promise lingered. No matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. Ghost settled beside the stretcher, body curled protectively, eyes never leaving the Marine, while the first hints of dawn streaked pale gold across the horizon, painting the world with fragile light. In that moment, the war faded to a background hum, replaced by the certainty of loyalty, the quiet triumph of recognition, and the beginning of healing that could only be measured in breaths shared and hearts aligned. Before the first full line of mourning reached the hospital tents, the unnamed Marine stirred again, and Ghost felt it before anyone spoke. The man's fingers moved against the blanket, slow and uncertain, brushing the empty space beside his chest as if searching for something that had once rested there. A nurse in desert tan scrubs stepped closer, her shoes making soft sounds against the rubber floor mats, but Ghost lifted his head and watched her with calm warning. Not anger, not fear, just a quiet line drawn in the air. The nurse stopped, glancing toward Dr. Amelia Hart, who stood near the foot of the stretcher with a clipboard pressed to her chest. Amelia had seen military working dogs before. She had seen loyalty trained into muscle and command. But this was different. This dog was not waiting for an order. He was waiting for a person to return from somewhere deeper than sleep. Outside, rainwater slid down the tent, seams and silver threads. The field hospital sat on the edge of a coastal transfer station outside San Diego, only a few hundred yards from the flight line, where transport aircraft came and went through the low gray weather. Every few minutes, the ground trembled with engines. Every few minutes, Ghost's ears turned toward the sound, then back to the man on the stretcher. He did not move away. Captain Daniel Hayes entered just after dawn, his uniform damp at the shoulders, his face carrying the tired gravity of a man who had signed too many reports before sunrise. He paused when he saw the white K9 lying beside the stretcher. "He's still here?" Hayes asked quietly. Dr. Hart nodded. "Since they brought the patient in." Hayes looked at the Marine's bandaged face, the swollen hands, the medical tags tied to the rail. "No confirmed identification?" "Not yet," Amelia said. "The recovery team found him at a relief checkpoint overseas. Paperwork was damaged during transit. He has partial memory loss, vocal strain, dehydration, and old injuries that were treated. Poorly but treated. Whoever he has been trying to get home for a long time." Hayes said nothing for a moment. His eyes dropped to Ghost. The dog's coat should have been clean white, but dust had settled into it, turning it the color of old ash. There were faint scars under the fur near his shoulders, and the left ear bore a small torn edge that made him look both noble and weathered. "That dog came in with the second evac group," Hayes murmured. "Refused food. Refused the kennel. Broke away twice. We thought he was tracking equipment." Dr. Hart looked toward the stretcher. Maybe he was tracking a promise. The words hung there, softer than the rain. The Marine's eyes opened again. This time they stayed open. Dark brown eyes, clouded with pain and confusion, moved slowly across the tent. They passed over the lights, the medical trays, the captain, the doctor. Then they found Ghost. Something changed in the room. Not dramatically, not loudly. It was smaller than that. The man's breathing caught, just once, as if his body remembered before his mind could. Ghost rose without a sound. Dr. Hart lifted a hand to stop him, but Hayes gently shook his head. "Let him." Ghost stepped forward one paw at a time, careful not to disturb the lines near the stretcher. His nose lowered to the Marine's wrist. He breathed in. Rain. Medicine. Dust. Human fear. And beneath it all, almost buried, the scent he had carried through sleep, hunger, engines, and distance. The man swallowed hard. His lips moved. No word came out. Ghost leaned closer. The Marine lifted his hand an inch, then two, until his fingers touched the damp fur between Ghost's eyes. The contact was light, barely there, but the dog closed his eyes as if it had weight enough to hold up the whole morning. No one in the tent spoke. Even the machine seemed quieter. Dr. Hart watched the Marine's pulse settle on the monitor, watched his breathing smooth, watched the tension leave his jaw in slow degrees. "That is not stress," she whispered. "That is recognition." Hayes stepped closer to the side of the bed. "Marine," he said gently, "can you hear me?" The man blinked once. "Do you know your name?" "Along." Silence followed. The Marine searched for it. You could see the effort move through him like weather over a dark field. His brow tightened. His fingers curled into Ghost's fur. But the name would not come. His eyes filled with frustration, not tears exactly, but something close to grief. The grief of standing at the door of your own life and finding it locked from the inside. Ghost pressed his head beneath the man's hand, refusing to let that grief have the final word. Hayes lowered his voice. "It is all right. You are safe." The Marine's gaze remained on Ghost. His mouth trembled around a broken breath. Then, faintly, almost too faint to hear, he shaped a sound. Not a name, not a command. A small three-note whistle, dry and cracked, barely alive in his throat. Ghost froze. His ears lifted. His whole body went still, as if the world had stopped spinning beneath his paws. Dr. Hart looked at Hayes. Hayes looked back, the color leaving his face. Ghost answered the whistle by stepping forward and placing his forehead against the Marine's chest. The man's hand fell over the dog's neck, holding on with the last strength he had. And somewhere beyond the rain, beyond the aircraft engines, beyond all the miles that had tried to separate them, a buried door opened. The Marine closed his eyes, and in a voice rough as gravel, he whispered, "Good boy." By noon, the rain over San Diego had thinned into a silver mist, and the field hospital breathed with the exhausted rhythm of men and women who had learned to move softly around pain. Ghost stayed at the wounded Marine's side, head resting near the stretcher rail, one ear tilted toward the monitor, the other toward the door. Dr. Amelia Hart had tried 3 times to guide him outside for food and water. Each time, Ghost rose politely, followed her 2 steps, then turned back as if an invisible leash still tied him to the man on the bed. Captain Daniel Hayes watched from the entrance with folded arms, saying nothing. He knew that kind of refusal. Marines called it stubbornness when they saw it in each other. In a dog, it looked almost holy. The Marine slept again after whispering those 2 words, but something in the tent had shifted. His pulse had steadied. His breathing had deepened. The lines around his eyes had softened, not enough to erase what he had survived, but enough to suggest that somewhere inside him, a locked room had opened. Amelia studied the temporary identification card clipped to the blanket. Unknown male. Approximate age, 30 to 35. Recovered at overseas aid station. Transferred through Ramstein. Arrival, San Diego. It was strange how little a piece of paper could know about a human being. It did not know the weight of his hand in Ghost's fur. It did not know the whistle. It did not know that the dog had gone still like a church bell struck by memory. Hayes stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Doctor, I need to know if he is strong enough for a memory prompt." Amelia did not look away from the patient. "A gentle one. Nothing sudden." Hayes nodded toward Ghost. "The dog may be the prompt." Outside, a transport aircraft rolled past the far side of the flight line, engines rumbling low through the wet ground. Ghost lifted his head. The Marine's fingers twitched. For a second, both of them seemed pulled backward by the same sound, toward another sky, another airfield, another morning heavy with dust instead of rain. And then the story inside the story began to rise. 3 years earlier, Staff Sergeant Isaiah Brooks had stood on a training field at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, under a hard blue spring sky with the Atlantic wind pushing against his back. He was 31 then, broad-shouldered, quiet, and careful with every movement, the kind of man younger Marines watched because he never wasted words. His skin was deep brown, his hair cut close, his face calm in a way that made people mistake silence for peace. But peace had not followed him home. It sat just out of reach, like sunlight on the other side of glass. He had returned from a difficult deployment with a commendation pinned to his record and a weight hidden behind his ribs. At night, he walked the base roads for miles because sleep came with too many doors opening. In the mornings, he reported early, boots clean, uniform squared, eyes tired but steady. No one questioned him. Marines were good at recognizing the shape of pain and pretending not to stare. The first time he saw a Ghost, the dog was sitting alone at the edge of the K9 yard, white fur bright against the red Carolina clay. The other dogs barked, lunged, tested the fences, eager for work. Ghost did none of that. He watched. His amber eyes followed every handler, every truck, every gull drifting over the training sheds. A young corporal laughed and said, "That one thinks too much." Another said Ghost was too sensitive, too quiet, too strange for combat work. Isaiah heard the words and kept walking until he stood 10 feet from the dog. Ghost did not come to him. Isaiah did not call. They simply looked at each other across the warm, dusty space between them. 2 creatures already tired of being misunderstood. The trainer, Gunnery Sergeant Miller, walked over with a clipboard tucked under one arm. "Beautiful dog," Miller said. "Smart, too. But he reacts to stress before commands. Some handlers do not like that." Isaiah kept his eyes on Ghost. "Maybe he is not reacting to stress." Miller frowned. "Then what is he reacting to?" Isaiah crouched slowly, resting one forearm on his knee. Ghost's ears shifted forward. "Truth," Isaiah said. The word was so quiet Miller almost missed it. A breeze moved through the yard, carrying the smell of cut grass, motor oil, and ocean salt. Ghost stood, took one careful step, then another. He stopped close enough for Isaiah to feel the warmth of his breath. The dog lowered his head, not in fear, but in decision. Isaiah reached out and touched the torn edge of Ghost's left ear, a small old injury from some training mishap no one remembered clearly. Ghost did not flinch. Instead, he leaned into the hand as if he had been waiting for someone who knew how to touch a wound without asking it to explain itself. From that day forward, they trained differently. Isaiah did not shout over Ghost. He breathed with him. He taught him hand signals so small they could disappear in shadow. 2 fingers down meant stay low. A closed fist meant wait. A soft 3-note whistle meant come back to me. And Ghost learned fast, not because he feared correction, but because he trusted the silence between commands. By the end of that first week, the other handlers stopped calling him too sensitive. By the end of the first month, no one laughed when Isaiah and Ghost crossed the field. They moved like one thought passing through 2 bodies. Back in the hospital tent, the unnamed Marine shifted under the blanket, his brow tightening as the memory brushed against him. Ghost rose and placed one paw lightly against the side of the stretcher. Dr. Hart stepped forward, then stopped when the monitor stayed calm. The Marine's lips moved in sleep. This time, the sound was clearer. Ghost. Hayes closed his eyes for half a second. Amelia looked down at the old patient tag again, then back at the man's face, seeing not an unknown anymore, but the outline of someone returning piece by piece. Ghost lowered his muzzle to Isaiah's hand and waited as the mist outside lifted, revealing a pale afternoon sun over the flight line. Some memories come back like thunder. Others return on 4 quiet paws, carrying the name you thought the world had lost. By late afternoon in the memory that had begun to return, Camp Lejeune glowed under a soft Carolina sun, the kind that turned dust gold and made the pine trees smell warm after rain. Isaiah Brooks and Ghost were no longer strangers standing on opposite sides of a training yard. They had become something quieter and harder to explain. Every morning before the rest of the kennel line woke, Isaiah arrived with 2 cups of black coffee, one for himself and one he never drank, setting the second on the wooden rail beside Ghost's run as if sharing silence required ceremony. Ghost would sit at the gate, white tail resting still against the concrete, amber eyes tracking the steam rising from the cup. Isaiah never rushed him. He would unlock the latch, step back, and let Ghost choose the first move. Some mornings the dog came out immediately, pressing his shoulder against Isaiah's knee. Other mornings he paused, listening to distant engines, birds above the barracks, boots on gravel 100 yards away. Isaiah understood that pause. He had one too, hidden behind his uniform and steady posture. Together they learned that trust was not built by forcing the door open. Trust was built by leaving the door unlocked long enough for the wounded part to come through on its own. Gunnery Sergeant Miller noticed first. During obstacle drills, other teams moved with sharp commands, loud corrections, and quick rewards. Isaiah and Ghost moved like low weather over the field. Isaiah's hand would drop half an inch, and Ghost would slow. Isaiah's fingers would open, and Ghost would circle left. A soft breath through Isaiah's teeth sent Ghost down into the grass before the trainer even saw the signal. It looked almost impossible from a distance, but up close it was simple. Isaiah paid attention. Ghost answered attention with faith. In the scent detection lanes, Ghost proved why sensitivity was not weakness. He did not just smell what he had been trained to smell. He noticed changes in people. He noticed when a young private's hands shook near the equipment table. He noticed when a mechanic tried to hide a limp after twisting his ankle near the motor pool. He noticed when Isaiah's breathing changed after a door slammed too hard behind the supply shed. That day, Isaiah had frozen for only a second. No one else caught it. Ghost did. The white shepherd crossed the room without command and leaned against Isaiah's leg with steady pressure, grounding him, bringing him back from a place no one could see. Isaiah lowered his hand into the dog's fur and kept his face turned away until the moment passed. "I am all right," he whispered. Ghost did not move, as if he knew better than to believe a sentence just because it sounded brave. After that, Isaiah began taking Ghost on evening walks along the quieter roads near the edge of base, where live oaks leaned over the pavement and the air smelled of marsh grass and distant ocean. They walked a mile, sometimes 2, with no training goal at all. Just movement. Just breath. Sometimes Isaiah talked to him. Not much. A sentence here. A name there. He told Ghost about his mother in Atlanta, who mailed him pecan cookies every Christmas even when he said he was too old for care packages. He told him about the church basement where he learned to tie his shoes, about the high school coach who said discipline could carry a man farther than anger, about the Marine he had once failed to save from loneliness, though he still carried that guilt like a folded letter in his chest. Ghost listened the way dogs listen, without interruption, without advice, without turning pain into a lesson. One Friday, after a long rain, Captain Daniel Hayes came to observe the pair. He stood with Miller near the training field while Isaiah guided Ghost through a mock village built from plywood walls and old doors. The ground was slick. The wind pushed mist across the lanes. Halfway through the course, a metal sign clattered loose in the distance, striking the ground with a sharp sound. Several dogs in the kennel line barked. Ghost stopped, ears forward, body low. Isaiah stopped too. He did not pull the leash. He did not speak. He simply lowered 2 fingers beside his thigh. Wait. Ghost waited. Isaiah breathed once, slow and deliberate. Then came the soft 3-note whistle, almost swallowed by the rain. Ghost turned back to him, crossed the open lane, and pressed his nose into Isaiah's palm. Captain Hayes watched with a careful expression. That dog trusts him more than the leash, he said. Miller nodded. And Brooks trusts that dog more than he trusts most people. Hayes looked toward Isaiah, who was kneeling now, wiping rainwater from Ghost's muzzle with the sleeve of his uniform. Maybe that is not a problem, Hayes said. Maybe that is the point. Weeks became months. Ghost earned his certifications one by one. Search, tracking, detection, recovery support, crowd calm, handler protection without aggression. Each test placed another mark in his file, but none captured what mattered most. Files could record performance. They could not record the night Ghost woke Isaiah before a panic dream could swallow him whole, placing both front paws gently on the edge of the cot until Isaiah opened his eyes to the dark barracks and realized he was home. Files could not record the morning Isaiah sat outside the kennel after receiving news of an old friend's passing, and Ghost laid his head across his boots until the sun climbed high enough to warm them both. Files did not understand grace. By the time deployment orders came, the bond between them had settled into something everyone on base recognized, but few could name. On their last evening at Camp Lejeune, Isaiah stood beside the transport crates while the sky turned violet over the flight line. Ghost sat close to his left leg, clean white coat brushed bright, collar fitted, eyes fixed on him. Isaiah crouched and clipped his own spare dog tag to Ghost's collar, tucking it beneath the strap so it would not swing loose. You stay with me, he said softly. Ghost blinked once, solemn as a promise. Isaiah touched the torn edge of the dog's left ear and gave the 3-note whistle. Ghost leaned forward until his forehead rested against Isaiah's chest. Across the tarmac, engines started to rise, deep and steady, calling them toward a place neither of them could yet understand. But for one quiet second, before duty swallowed the evening, a man who had forgotten how to ask for mercy and a dog who had been mistaken for too fragile stood together in the fading light, and the world felt almost kind. The evening air outside the hospital tent had settled into a quiet hum, the damp asphalt reflecting the last streaks of light from the setting sun. Ghost shifted his weight slightly, ears swiveling at the faintest sound of wheels or footsteps beyond the canvas walls. Inside, the Marine's chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm now, but his eyes remained partially closed, clouded with the residue of months spent between recovery and memory gaps. Dr. Amelia Hart moved carefully around the stretcher, adjusting blankets and checking monitors, her voice low and steady when she spoke, but she did not disturb Ghost. The dog seemed to understand, moving only as needed to press his muzzle closer to the Marine's hand, reminding him of presence without demanding acknowledgement. Captain Daniel Hayes leaned against a support pole, glancing at the pair as if observing a ritual that was private yet shared with the whole world. Outside, the sky had darkened to a deep indigo, and the distant hum of an arriving transport aircraft carried faintly through the air, blending with the soft whistle of a breeze that slipped beneath the tent flaps. Ghost lifted his head, sniffing, listening to both the interior and the exterior, sensing the faintest vibrations of movement along the tent floor. The Marine stirred again, this time blinking fully, his green-gray eyes scanning the room, tracking the contours of the dog's white coat, the curve of the ears, the subtle tension along the spine that spoke of readiness and understanding. For a long moment, the two simply regarded each other in the silence, neither moving, both absorbing the weight of the hours spent apart, the months of absence, and the unspoken trust that had survived the distance. Ghost shifted closer, resting a paw lightly across the Marine's wrist, and the touch seemed to anchor him further into the present, into the reality of being alive and attended to. Amelia Hart stepped back slightly, her clipboard held loosely against her side, noting the subtle but profound changes in the Marine's responses. His breathing more even, fingers no longer twitching with anxiety, pupils adjusting to light without startle. Hayes whispered to her, "That dog has been his anchor longer than any of us knew." Ghost let out a low, steady exhale, almost a sigh, before lowering his head to rest beside the Marine's shoulder. The man's lips moved, a sound faint but intentional, forming a soft whistle, a pattern that had been familiar in another time, another place. Ghost froze, ears pricked, then moved deliberately forward, pressing his forehead gently against the Marine's chest, a silent acknowledgement of recognition that carried with it the weight of memory and the promise of protection. Outside, the mist had begun to thin, revealing the faint outlines of distant hangars and the soft glow of runway lights. The sound of water dripping from the tent flaps mixed with the muted rumbles from the aircraft, creating a rhythm that seemed to pulse through both Marine and dog. The Marine's hand closed around Ghost's fur, tentative at first, then firmer as confidence returned, grounding both of them. In the half-light, shadows of medical equipment stretched long across the floor, but neither Marine nor dog noticed. The world had narrowed to the warmth of the fur beneath fingers, the steady exhale of breath, the continuity of loyalty that had survived absence and uncertainty. A soft whiff of antiseptic and wet earth hung in the air, mingling with the faint saltiness carried from the nearby harbor, bringing the memory of field exercises, long marches, and quiet nights under stars far from home. Ghost adjusted, circling slightly before lying down, leaving enough space for the Marine to shift, but close enough to signal that he would not abandon this vigil. The Marine's eyelids fluttered, a half-smile forming as recognition deepened, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the steady presence of a companion who had not wavered, not for a second, in the knowledge that he would return. Outside, rainwater collected in shallow pools, reflecting the dim light from the tent above, rippling softly as a breeze passed. Inside, time seemed to slow, compressing hours and days into a single, quiet moment where the past and present met. Months of separation, training, deployment, and the uncertain survival that had kept both Marine and dog bound by an invisible line of trust and loyalty. Ghost rested his chin on the Marine's hand, eyes half closed, listening to the subtle rise and fall of the chest beneath him, feeling the pulse of life steady and strong. The Marine exhaled slowly, a deep and measured breath, and whispered, almost to himself, "I am here. I am back." Ghost pressed closer, nudging the hand against his snout, anchoring that statement with the certainty of a bond that had been tested by time, distance, and circumstance, but had never once been broken. The tent remained quiet, punctuated only by the occasional creak of canvas and the distant hum of engines, the world outside continuing its indifferent rhythm while inside, loyalty and trust had reclaimed their rightful place, one paw and one heartbeat at a time. The night outside the hospital tent had deepened into a soft, enveloping darkness, and the air carried the faint scent of rain-soaked asphalt and the distant ocean. Ghost remained at the Marine's side, his white coat glowing faintly in the dim light from the overhead lamps, eyes alert yet calm. The Marine, Isaiah Brooks, lay with his head resting lightly on the pillow, eyelids half closed, yet the smallest movements in his chest and fingers betrayed awareness of the dog's presence. Dr. Amelia Hart moved quietly around the tent, checking monitors and adjusting blankets, her voice a low hum of reassurance whenever she spoke, but Ghost hardly noticed. The dog's attention was fixed entirely on Isaiah, observing the subtle shifts in breathing, the faint twitch of fingers, the rise and fall of chest and shoulders. Outside, The sound of distant vehicles rolling across the flight line echoed faintly through the canvas, mingling with the soft rustle of the rain dripping from the tent flaps. Ghost shifted slightly, pressing closer to Isaiah, sensing the ebb and flow of energy and emotion from him, and responding with the measured patience that had been trained through months of shared routines and silent communication. Isaiah's eyes opened fully this time, catching the light in Ghost's amber gaze. Recognition, a spark buried under layers of memory loss and trauma, began to flicker. He lifted a trembling hand and ran it along the dog's neck, feeling the familiar warmth and weight, and Ghost leaned into the touch, a low exhale signaling the comfort of reunion. The air inside the tent seemed heavier yet more grounded, the quiet punctuated only by the faint hum of medical equipment and the occasional whisper of conversation between nurses and attending staff. Captain Daniel Hayes stood near the entrance, arms folded, observing the unfolding bond. He did not speak, knowing better than to break the rhythm of the moment. Isaiah's chest rose and fell in long, even breaths as he slowly sat up, supported by pillows. Ghost moved with him, positioning his body close, keeping one paw gently on the edge of the stretcher as if to offer both balance and reassurance. Outside, the clouds began to shift, letting through slivers of moonlight that illuminated the tent floor in soft silver lines. The Marine's gaze traveled along Ghost's white fur, noting the small scars and faint discolorations that spoke of previous hardships, yet did not diminish the steadfastness in his stance. Isaiah's lips parted, forming words that were soft, broken, but intentional. "I remember," he whispered, his voice carrying a fragile but undeniable certainty. Ghost's ears pricked, and he pressed his muzzle closer, sensing the acknowledgement of a promise kept, a bond restored. Amelia Hart watched the subtle exchange, noting how the dog's stillness seemed to command the room, teaching patience and the power of presence. Hayes shifted his weight, careful not to draw attention, and glanced down at the monitors, reading the stable heartbeat and calm respiration as signs not only of physical recovery, but emotional recalibration. The Marine adjusted his position, and Ghost moved in harmony, leaning against his side, resting a head on the shoulder as Isaiah's hand traced the fur slowly, methodically, reinforcing the quiet reassurance that they were no longer alone. Beyond the tent, the flight line lay under the soft silver haze of the moonlight, engines idle for the moment, shadows stretching long across the concrete. Inside, the shared silence between man and dog was full, carrying with it the weight of distant memories, of months apart, of unspoken trials survived. Ghost shifted once more, curling lightly against Isaiah's side, eyes half closed, ears attuned to every subtle sound, yet trusting the present. Isaiah's gaze softened as he traced the faint scar along the dog's ear, a marker of past endurance, a symbol of resilience, and he whispered again, "We are together now." Ghost let out a low, steady sigh, pressing closer, and the room seemed to exhale with them, the weight of absence lifting, replaced by the quiet, steadfast rhythm of loyalty, understanding, and the comfort of a promise honored, one breath, one paw, one heartbeat at a time. By morning, Isaiah Brooks could say his own name, though it came out rough and slow, like a man pulling a heavy rope from deep water. Dr. Amelia Hart wrote it carefully on the chart that had once called him unknown, and Captain Daniel Hayes stood beside the bed without speaking for a moment, because some names deserve silence when they finally return. Ghost sat at Isaiah's left side, exactly where he had always belonged, his white chest lifted, his amber eyes following every breath. The field hospital had changed around them with the daylight. Nurses moved faster. Radios murmured. A helicopter passed low enough to shake the metal tray beside the bed, and for one sharp second Isaiah's hand tightened in Ghost's fur. Ghost did not flinch. He leaned in, solid and warm, and Isaiah came back to the room before the memory could take him too far. But the memory was coming anyway. It had been waiting behind the sound of engines, behind the smell of wet canvas, behind the three-note whistle that had opened the first door. Isaiah closed his eyes, and the hospital faded into dust-colored sunlight. The war zone came back not as chaos, but as heat, a hard, dry heat that settled on the skin and turned every breath into work. They had been stationed near a small village tucked between low hills and a broken road, a place that did not look important on a map, but mattered to every family still trapped there. The village had a school with blue shutters, a well in the center square, and a row of olive trees that bent in the wind like old men at prayer. Children had drawn chalk stars on one wall before the fighting moved too close. Isaiah remembered those stars more clearly than he remembered the briefing. Captain Hayes had stood over a folded map on the hood of a tan vehicle, his jaw tight beneath the brim of his cover. "We get the families out before sundown," he said. "We stay calm, we stay clean, and nobody gets left behind." Ghost stood beside Isaiah, his white coat hidden beneath dust, his nose lifted toward the village. He was quiet, too quiet. Corporal Mason Reed, young and restless, shifted his rifle strap and glanced at the dog. He always stared like that. Isaiah did not look away from Ghost. Only when he knows something before we do. The road into the village stretched less than half a mile, but it felt longer because silence had settled over it wrong. No chickens moving. No voices from windows. No metal doors clanging in the wind. Just dust curling across the ground and the faint creak of an old sign above a shuttered shop. Ghost moved first, low and careful, his paws touching the earth as if reading it. Isaiah followed the leash, but did not pull. He let Ghost lead with his nose, with his ears, with whatever secret language the world gave to animals and denied to men. 20 yards from the well, Ghost stopped. His body stiffened. 2 fingers from Isaiah meant hold. Ghost held. Captain Hayes lifted his hand, and the whole team froze. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ghost lowered his nose near a patch of disturbed dirt beside the road, then looked back at Isaiah. Not panic. Not fear. Certainty. Isaiah felt the old respect move through his chest. "We change route," he said. Mason frowned. "Through the alley?" "Through the alley." No one argued after Ghost found the second warning sign near the school wall, and then a third beneath a cracked step where an old woman might have walked if Ghost had not stopped her first. By late afternoon, the Marines had moved 32 civilians toward the evacuation point beyond the olive trees. Isaiah remembered a little girl clutching a yellow backpack against her chest. He remembered Nadia Cole, the local interpreter, walking backward while translating instructions in a voice steadier than her hands. He remembered Ghost pausing beside a doorway, turning his head toward the school even after the line of families had already moved on. There it was. The moment everything changed. A sound so small most men would have missed it. Not a cry, not a shout. A tiny scraping from inside the school, followed by silence. Ghost looked at Isaiah. Isaiah looked at the blue shutters, one hanging loose, tapping gently against the wall. Captain Hayes saw the look and shook his head once. "Brooks, we are out of time." Ghost took one step toward the school. Isaiah's hand tightened around the leash, not to stop him, but to tell him he had heard it too. Nadia turned pale. "There may be someone inside," she whispered. Mason looked toward the lowering sun, then back at the school. "Sergeant, we have families in the open." Isaiah knew. He knew the clock. He knew the risk. He knew orders had weight for a reason. But he also knew the sentence Hayes had spoken over the map. Nobody gets left behind. Ghost gave no bark, no dramatic pull, no wild display. He simply stood facing the school with the stillness of a creature whose whole life had narrowed to one truth. Isaiah crouched beside him and touched the torn edge of his left ear. "You hear him?" Ghost blinked once. Isaiah unclipped the short lead and replaced it with the longer line from his vest. His voice stayed calm, but inside him something old had begun to burn clean. "Captain, give me 3 minutes." Hayes stared at him, rainless dust moving between them like a veil. "You get 2. Isaiah nodded. 2 minutes could be a lifetime when loyalty was counting. He looked down at Ghost and gave the smallest signal, 2 fingers forward. Ghost entered the school first, white fur disappearing into the dim hallway, and Isaiah followed him into the cool shadow where chalk dust floated in the air like pale smoke. Behind them, the village held its breath. Ahead of them, somewhere beyond a fallen shelf and a classroom door half open, a child was waiting for someone to believe a small sound could still matter. The hallway of the old school smelled of chalk dust and faint mildew, sunlight slicing through broken windows to highlight the motes dancing in the air like tiny suspended lanterns. Ghost moved quietly, paws whispering against the worn wooden floor, tail low but firm, amber eyes scanning the space for the subtle signs that only a dog with months of observation and shared experience could read. Isaiah Brooks followed closely, breathing measured and deliberate, hand hovering near the dog as if to touch, but not to command. The faint creak of a hinge in a distant classroom drew their attention, and Ghost's ears twitched, signaling the presence of something alive, something waiting, not in fear, but in expectation. Isaiah crouched slightly, letting his body align with the dog, sensing the rhythm that had once governed their drills and daily walks. Observation first, movement second, reaction last. The room they entered was small and cool, the tiles worn and slightly uneven, walls faded from pale blue to a muted gray, each corner carrying the faint echoes of voices and footsteps from another time. Ghost paused near a pile of desks, nose low, sniffing the air, tilting his head as if confirming the presence he had already sensed. Isaiah knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on the dog's neck, feeling the tension in muscle and sinew, understanding that the pause was the answer itself. A small sound, barely audible, emerged from behind a toppled chair, soft, irregular, almost a breath. Ghost froze and then stepped lightly toward it, body language calm, focused, controlled. Isaiah mirrored the movement, letting the dog lead without pulling, trusting the instinct that had been honed over countless exercises, countless missions, countless moments of quiet trust. The sound came again, a soft rustling followed by a whisper of movement, and Ghost's tail shifted slightly, a single, deliberate wag of recognition that prompted Isaiah to raise his hand and signal patience. The light through the window illuminated the edge of a dusty crate, inside which a small bundle stirred, curled up and vulnerable. Ghost approached, lowering his muzzle to the crate, sniffing carefully, and Isaiah felt the release of tension in the dog's body, the slow exhale of understanding that all was as it should be. He reached in and gently lifted the child from the crate, careful and deliberate, positioning the bundle against his chest as Ghost circled close, alert to every detail in the space, every possible change in air and shadow. Outside, the village streets were quiet, dust settling after the activity of the day, sunlight warming the low stone walls and olive trees, carrying a soft breeze scented with earth and distant salt. Nadia Cole, the local interpreter, emerged from the alley and approached, her eyes wide with relief as she saw the child safe and the dog watching vigilantly. Isaiah stood slowly, adjusting the hold on the child, and Ghost moved beside him, ears forward, eyes fixed on every movement, ready to signal any deviation or hidden concern. The team followed behind, careful not to rush, to respect the rhythm established between man and dog. Every step was deliberate, measured, and held with the unspoken trust that Ghost would not lead them astray. By the time they emerged into the sunlight, the village had begun to return to its ordinary rhythm, the distant hum of life filtering through open doors and across the stone streets. Ghost paused at the edge of the square, lifting his head, amber eyes sweeping over the path ahead, ensuring the group was aligned, safe, and unbroken. Isaiah placed the child in Nadia's arms, feeling the weight of the moment, the culmination of trust, patience, and unwavering loyalty. Ghost sat, poised and watchful, as the team began moving toward the evacuation point, the sun now high, casting long shadows behind them. The air seemed lighter, carrying the faint warmth of hope and quiet triumph. And Isaiah, still standing beside Ghost, finally allowed himself a breath long enough to release months of tension, feeling the depth of a bond reaffirmed, the presence of a companion whose patience and understanding had guided them through uncertainty and ensured that no one had been left behind. In that moment, the lessons of training, trust, and silent communication coalesced into a living testament of partnership, a reminder that the smallest attentiveness could shape outcomes, that patience and loyalty could navigate even the most uncertain corridors, and that Ghost's watchful gaze ensured the promise of safety and companionship endured as the team moved steadily toward the light beyond the village square. The late afternoon sun bathed the village in soft amber light, casting long shadows across the streets where families moved quietly toward safety, carrying children, bundles, and the faint hum of relief operations. Ghost remained at Isaiah Brooks' side, white coat gleaming faintly under the sun, amber eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. for any sign of disturbance or lingering uncertainty. Isaiah, steady now on both feet, felt the familiar weight of Ghost's presence beside him, the subtle pressure of the dog's shoulder against his leg, grounding him in the reality of return and presence. Nadia Cole guided the last of the villagers toward the evacuation point, glancing back to ensure that both Marine and dog were following. Isaiah adjusted the strap of his field pack, feeling the pulse of the day, the rhythm of dust, the faint breeze carrying salt from the distant coast, the soft scrape of boots and sandals across worn stone and dirt. Ghost stepped lightly, circling behind a low wall to check the path, then back to Isaiah, signaling silently that the route was clear. Isaiah reached down and touched the dog's fur, noting the faint lines of old scars, the slightly uneven edges of ears that had weathered training, deployments, and absence, yet the gaze remained unwavering. Each step forward reinforced months of trust, patience, and understanding that had been tested in the most uncertain conditions, a bond that words alone could never have conveyed. They moved together, fluid and deliberate, a single unit navigating the light and shadow, past broken fences, around overturned carts, and beneath leaning trees, the air carrying the faint scent of wet earth, pine, and distant salt. Ghost paused at a narrow archway, nostrils flaring slightly, eyes lifting to Isaiah, who nodded once in quiet acknowledgement. The dog passed first, moving with care and attentiveness. Then Isaiah followed, hand hovering near the dog without touching, a silent agreement of space and trust. In the square beyond, children peeked from doorways, their eyes wide with curiosity and relief, and Isaiah allowed himself the briefest smile, aware of the lives returned to safety and the role Ghost had played in guiding them through uncertainty. They reached the final edge of the village, where medical tents and relief vehicles had been set up, and the last civilians moved under the watchful direction of aid workers. Ghost came to a stop at the center of the square, body poised, head low but eyes bright, waiting for Isaiah. The Marine approached, breathing steady and deep, and crouched beside him, hands sliding along the dog's neck and shoulder, grounding himself in the touch, in the certainty of presence, in the continuity of loyalty that had brought them both here. Amelia Hart observed from the edge of the square, her gaze softening at the sight of the quiet interaction, the dog and Marine perfectly aligned, each responding to the other without words. Captain Hayes stepped forward, his usual stern demeanor softened by the relief of seeing both man and dog safe, and he nodded once, subtly, acknowledging the completion of a mission measured not only in distance traveled or people protected, but in the reclamation of trust, courage, and unwavering companionship. Ghost exhaled slowly, settling beside Isaiah as the Marine pressed a hand gently against his muzzle, eyes sweeping the square and beyond, registering not just the physical safety, but the restoration of confidence and calm after months of uncertainty. The sun dipped lower, streaking the sky with gold and crimson, light falling over the shoulders of both Marine and dog as they watched the village return to quiet rhythm, the gentle movement of families, the soft shuffle of relief personnel, the faint clatter of supplies being organized. Isaiah whispered to Ghost, voice low and reverent, "We made it back, boy. We are home." Ghost pressed his forehead into Isaiah's palm, a small but resolute gesture that carried the weight of months of absence, trust tested and upheld, and the simple, profound joy of reunion. Around them, the village held its quiet breath, not in tension but in the soft exhale of relief, the day folding into evening, shadows lengthening, and the warm hum of life continuing uninterrupted. Ghost remained at Isaiah's side, watchful yet calm, and Isaiah stood slowly, brushing dust from his uniform, feeling the steady warmth of the dog beside him, knowing that the bond between them had not only endured but deepened, cemented by shared presence, silent understanding, and the gentle, unspoken promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, one step, one heartbeat, one paw at a time.